and they say, denounce the Book of Mormon, denounce your testimony, or you're going to make widows of all these people that we have the guns pointed to. Well, this is a moment, right? A moment of persecution. How would you react? How would I react? David Whitmer began to preach about the truth of what he had seen with his own eyes for himself. We end up in contrived and ad hoc explanations if you're not willing to admit that God exists and Jesus rose from the dead. But for the golden plates, the evidence is overwhelming. There's astounding on historical grounds. If this was anything besides a miracle in question, anything besides the golden plates in question, if this was any other event from history and we had this much data, it would be in every history book on the topic in a formative and assertive way.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. This is part 2 of the interview that I've been doing with Josh Gehly, who is the author of this book, Witnessing Miracles, the Historical Evidence for the Resurrection and the Book of Mormon. Go back and watch part 1, where we talked about the case and the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And part 2, we're going to be transitioning to talk about the case and the evidence for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and for the witnesses of the gold plates. And Josh, thanks for coming back for part 2.
I love that you have me on. This is a treat.
Yeah, this has been really fun. Now, actually, before we talk about the Book of Mormon, there's one question or pushback that I want to give, because I do have critical listeners, and they might say, with regards to the evidence for the resurrection, and you talk about this in your book, that most scholars would say that the Gospel of Mark was written 3 to 4 decades after, around AD 65 to 70. You mentioned that certain things like 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostles' Creed about Jesus' resurrection, likely came a couple of years after. But some might push back that the Gospels were written decades after, and that, critics like Bart Ehrman would point out contradictions or different discrepancies in some of the narrative in, like, say, the crucifixion, or who appears at the tomb, or Judas dies 2 different ways. John has a very high Christology. So they might say, are the Gospels really that reliable? Now, I know that's a huge topic, but they might put that as pushback, and that some of this has come from oral tradition, and is this really strong evidence for Christ's resurrection? What would be your response to that before we go to the Book of Mormon?
Well, first off, that's a great question. And there's a lot of information that's out there to kind of answer some of that. I do find the gospel accounts reliable. And so there's a whole series of methodologies to give the reason why. I am not as worried about, okay, so when we look at a minimal facts argument, okay, we would say, well, this gospel says Judas died this way. That gospel says he died that way. And maybe there's ways to reconcile that. I'm not even going to make that point. What if I conceded it and said, no, it shows 2 totally different ways that are irreconcilable? They're both saying Judas killed himself, that he died after Jesus died. That's a remarkable fact to find common ground with from an independently attested sources, if we're taking these gospels not as scripture but as sources. Now, Luke is incredible. I could give 50 reasons for Luke to be such an incredible source. A lot of people call Pilate the prefect, right? Luke calls him the governor. All right. And now this is something people, got to dig up and look at. And you might think, well, that's not, and actually this was a criticism of Luke for some time. And Luke tended to get criticized, and he tends to prove people wrong over time because he did a really good job. And there's actually been some early archaeological sources that now show that the term that Luke used to address Pilate was the exact, correct, historically accurate term. And the terms that came later were based on people making assumptions about the role that Pilate had, not the actual role that he had. So there's nuances like that to say, no, 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 these are people trying to truly tell what is going on. Now, here's another small argument that I would make too. There's things as simple as names of the disciples. Simple, simple stuff. The names. These are all names that the now some of the names say, you know, give an explanation, like Matthew, the tax collector. Some Judas Iscariot, all right? Well, it's the most common names from the first century in Palestine that are given the explanation, which means this is evidence for this text being written to people who were from that period of time in that location. And that demonstrates the fact that it's actually from the correct time, describing people who were really living, and they're giving verifiable evidence for their descriptions of the names that. So the most common names needed an explanation of who they were, especially when there's multiples of them within the disciples. Now that might seem like a nothing burger, but it's something when you're considering whether or not these are historical or not. And even a little fact like at the feeding of the 5,000, where Christ addresses Philip and tells him to be the one to, maybe look for food at first. Well, in one of the other Gospels, it says that Philip was from the area where the feeding of the 5,000 was. Now, the account that describes the feeding of the 5,000 doesn't give that description of from Philip, but it identifies the town where it took place. And so now when we put these Gospels together with a little bit of harmony, we can realize that Jesus is addressing the local to send him out to get the food. Okay? Well, these are all subtle things that demonstrate that the New Testament accounts are accurate. They're describing real events that happened historically from people who were actually there and present and knew the area. There's a lot of examples like that. I'm rolling off the cuff here, but there's probably countless, not countless, but there's dozens and dozens and dozens of subtle examples like that. So if we want to talk about contradictions, I would also raise my hand and say, yeah, but can we also talk about some of the arguments for that would only account for somebody that was in the place and time describing the things that happened? And then, yes, let's also address contradictions. I'm for that. But let's have both hand in hand and have an honest discussion versus a one-sided throw it out with baby with the bathwater discussion.
Right. And it's also not a belief or an assumption of, I'll just say, believers in the restoration in biblical inerrancy that we accept that there could be
Yeah,
some errors or some discrepancies in there. And I think, like you said, it's also looking at things that seem very consistent with the time and the place and between the Gospels as well. And I sort of see it as, yeah, these are being written by different authors. Some of it being passed down from oral tradition, but I personally believe that there's truth to the core of it, even if there are some differences, and don't feel the need to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to it.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, actually, one point you made in the book, which I thought was interesting, is you talked about before Jesus came, there seemed to be this, you could say, drought of there being a prophet or any new scripture. And then, along with all of these visionary experiences of the risen, seeing the risen Lord and the apostles going out and testifying and building the church, they're adding to the scriptural canon. Paul's letters and these gospel accounts, and that we see something similar with the restoration and then the coming forth of new scripture. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Jesus came during a time period of written prophetic silence. They were faithfully copying the scribal traditions from their past. They were not creating new tradition in the present. And there's even historians that write about that are contemporaries to the time period. One of the best examples is Josephus. And he says, yeah, we haven't had a prophet saying, thus saith the Lord to record since the time period. And he goes back to basically the closing of the Hebrew Bible, right? So when the Hebrew Bible closed up, or what we would call the Old Testament closed up, they were not having that prophetic voice saying, thus saith the Lord. The astounding thing is the disciples claimed authority within their own writings to declare that and to be, their writings were considered scripture. Peter commends in his second letter, he commends the letters of Paul, and he says sometimes they're hard to wrestle with, just like any other scripture. So by saying that almost offhand comment, he is solidifying the fact that Paul's letters were considered scripture even in Peter's day. Okay, so this self proclamation of having authority from heaven to write and for those writings to be considered scriptural is remarkable for the New Testament church. And obviously, the Book of Mormon launched in a similar world. Okay, very different world, but also in this way similar. The similarity here is it came from a time period when the canon was closed,
Right.
right? You might debate whether the Bible was 66 books or whether there were a couple more books from the Apocrypha that should be included. Maybe there's a little scuffle there, but in every way, shape, and form, the Bible had been untouched for millennia, right? So it had not been added to for well over 1,500 years. There was nothing new being added, there was nothing being taken away. And even the doctrine of much of Christendom was that it was sealed for eternity. The doors were shut. And the Book of Mormon came countercultural to everything. Nobody, this is a little bit of an N.T. Wright argument. Okay, because N.T. Wright talks about counterculture, how the resurrection of Christ was countercultural to the idea and concept of resurrection in first century Judea. The
Yes, yes.
concept of a new piece of scripture launching forward in the 19th century was counterculture to everything within the religious practices of Christendom at that time. There were popular writings, popular books, new religious movements happening left and right, but nobody was adding something new to their canon, something new to their scripture, something new to the Bible. That was a revolutionary concept that would have seemed like an open, in that time, would have seemed like an open shut case. You don't do that. You don't do that. And yet, the Book of Mormon comes off unapologetically and launches itself into the historical narrative, into the biblical narrative. It quotes from the Bible, it records its own religious history, and it just goes forward and does not apologize for itself and claims itself to be both made by humans, okay? It's humble in some of its presentation. It doesn't claim to be free from error necessarily. In fact, the almost some of the writers apologize for the errors and limitations of their script that they had, but it also 100% claims to be scripture, asks you to judge it for or against. And the explanation is if you're wrong, I'll see at the pleading bar of God. I mean, it is, the authors are almost prescriptive in the outcome based on your belief or not belief within the text of the pages itself. And it comes into an era where the canon was shut and it blows those doors wide open, just like the New Testament church
Mm.
disciples did.
And we don't have the gold plates, but what we do have here as a fact, and I think you listed as one of your facts, is the Book of Mormon. We have the book. It's a fact. It exists, and you have to explain where it came from. So maybe you could talk first about some of the facts surrounding the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Talk about the timeline, the eyewitness testimony, the nature of the translation and the dictation. We could talk about some of those facts.
Sure. So Joseph procures the plates in 1823, or he first visits the hill in 1823. He procures the plates in 1827 from the hill. He visits every year, and then from 1827 he has the plates. He then very quickly goes to Pennsylvania to do some translation. Martin is assisting, Emma assists during that time. Then we have the lost pages where they take a chunk of the translation. Martin brings it back to show family, yada yada yada, and we've
They go
now got
missing.
a, yeah, we've got a missing part of text. Okay, and then translation then really stumbles, and time is goes by a little bit. The plates are still in Joseph's possession at that point, and then Oliver comes on the scene, and very quickly everything changes. Oliver and Joseph really launch into translation on April 7th, 1829. They are done by June 30th. And this is a great spot. Jack Welch has done great research on this, connecting both the translation timing to journal entries and letters being written by those who are involved to line up where they were in the translation over what period of time. But overall, you have 239 quote unquote chapters that we have today in our text. We have the same versification as you. So 239 chapters are produced, hundreds of thousands of words being spanned. And when you do the measurements, the length of the Book of Mormon precisely matches the timeline when you subtract days for worship. A new church is starting. Sundays are busy. They're not translating, they're proclaiming the gospel, they're going things forward. So when you take that like 85-day period ish from
And there's
April
also a
7th to
lot of
June 30th,
early revelations are being dictated as well amongst this time with the Book of Mormon as well. And then, there's day trips, and then they move at one point from Harmony up to it's Fayette, New York, isn't it? To the
yep.
Whitmer family. So it's not that every single day was being spent, just on the translation of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, so it breaks down when you subtract all those days out, because you're right, there's over 6,100 words of revelation that are being handwritten as well. You end up with about somewhere between 65 to 57 working days to produce the text. And that matches with about a 10 word to 15 word per minute. It lines up really well that that would be the pace that would be required to complete a dictated Book of Mormon within the exact time frame that it's given. That's a subtle evidence, but it is an evidence. The Book of Mormon length and period matches the manuscript. The other piece of it is within that time period, so we have the manuscript to examine the method of production, right? And so, like Royal Skousen did great work. The Critical Text Project of the Book of Mormon, amazing. I love everything about it.
I'm hoping to bring him
And
on soon, by the way, to talk about that.
oh, he's an all-star in my book, absolute all-time all-star. I mean, 30 years worth of labor for what has been now produced on it. But the fundamental understanding that this was being the evidence from the manuscript showing that this was being read aloud, this was being dictated from Joseph. You know, take the miracle on the shelf for a moment, but the evidence from the manuscript shows that Joseph is speaking aloud. The scribe is writing it down, reading it back to him. They're making any necessary corrections and then going forward. The way that that shows up is things like, you know, spelling of words and different crossouts and editing marks being used seems to be showing that someone it's not being copied. Someone is reading, someone is writing, someone is making a correction, and then they move forward. And that's
Mm.
astounding. There's not time within this window, both from the evidence that shows the length of time being used. There's not time to start and stop and pick up and where were we, and it just goes forward. And all
Very
the
rapid.
evidence shows that the witnesses that say, hey, it happened this way via dictation, that's exactly what you find with the evidence from the manuscript itself. It's a subtle thing, but it's relevant to consider that the artifact that you mentioned was composed in 65 days or less on the original manuscript. And then that is the text that you're dealing with now, the artifact that you're dealing with to counter explain. It really is astounding what was made, the depth and breadth of the narrative. You start talking about the hundreds and hundreds of internal consistencies within the text. Something's prophesied, something's fulfilled, something's spoken of. Coriantumr and Ether is left for dead, but it doesn't really say he died. And then that's in a completely different book from a completely different group of people. And then hundreds and not hundreds of years later, but like multiple books later, completely in a random additional part of the section, it talks about Coriantumr being with that group of people. Those type of
And that would
internal
have been
consistencies
later
happen all the
in the
time.
dictation. Wouldn't that would have been later in the dictation? Like one thing that was pointed out to me that I thought was interesting is in the Book of Alma. So most scholars believe that they continued after the last 116 pages, him and Oliver from Mosiah, and in let me think, Alma 36. Alma talks about methought I saw God surrounded by his angels on his throne, even as Lehi. But at that point, Lehi, that hadn't been dictated yet in First Nephi. Now you could say maybe that was on the missing 116 pages, but then Joseph, as the author, he would have had to then remember later when he came around to doing First Nephi, because they did the small plates after once they got to Moroni, to add in that verse about Lehi, and it's like a word for word quote, and that's just there's lots of complexity to it, like you said, like the chronology, the different calendar systems, the different civilizations, the different record keepers, the internal consistent geography, and all that. That's a lot for one person not only to write, but to do a creative oral dictation. And none of the eyewitnesses or scribes talk about Joseph having notes or a manuscript or consulting any other materials, but just the translation instruments.
And even those that would claim automatic writing, it just doesn't match the breadth and depth of what and the complexity of everything that's within the text. So some would say, okay, fine, he dictated it all, but this is some form of automatic writing where he's just in a trance, speaking out loud, laying out this narration. But the internal consistency of the document does not bear that out. It's way more complex than that. It's a very well thought out. I mean, Alma 36 is like my favorite chapter in the whole book. It's a giant chiasm, right? I mean, with like, it's just amazing how many points crescend and decrescend and perfectly matching. And it's just not something that could have been orally done all by itself. To have 39 different forms of Hebraisms throughout the text, the inner and a perfectly, the internal map is something everybody can draw. And when you draw, you kind of come up to similar conclusions. You might debate a little bit about, where one city is, but overall, the layout of the landscape matches itself internally and is consistent. It's really astounding.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of complexity to it, and the eyewitnesses, as you said, the scribes like Emma, Martin Harris, Oliver Whitmer, or Oliver Cowdery, sorry, and even others that participated, confirm that it was by dictation using either seer stone or the interpreters, placing them in a hat predominantly. And you're saying that the original manuscript supports that the method of translation was dictation, as they said.
100%. So when you talk about making an explanation of the facts, these are some of the facts that need laid out for you to make an explanation or counter explanation for the production mode and means of the text, right? So that's what we're talking about. How do you best explain the fact that eyewitnesses said, here's how it happened? And we have the document, we have the manuscript, and the evidence from the manuscript is matching that. So it makes it more believable to follow the eyewitnesses on other things they said as well.
Right. Yeah, totally. And I don't want to spend too much time into this because we want to talk a lot about the witnesses of the gold plates. Could be fun in a subsequent episode. There's been different naturalistic theories. Obviously, one of the first ones was the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, which has been debunked whenever the manuscript was found. Comparing it to the Book of Mormon, there wasn't strong similarities. And again, the original manuscript supports dictation, not that they were copying from some text. Now, there have been different naturalistic theories for the Book of Mormon. Whenever I sort of was in my faith Christ and stepped away from the church, I was quite convinced by, Graham Palmer or Dan Vogel that he's drawing from different 19th century sources or influences. And then I think probably one of the best naturalistic theories I've had on William Davis, and I've read his book, and I kind of thought like it was probably one of the more plausible naturalistic theories of Joseph doing sort of like oral performance, laying down heads, doing this. I think he described it as a semi-extemporaneous dictation, that he had basically everything planned out in his head. He'd studied out in his mind for years, and then he would just orally dictate with an outline, but then it was still sort of this dictation that he could alter things on the spot. What's your thoughts on that naturalistic theory that it was done by oral performance or automatic writing, that he's drawing upon all these influences from his milieu, but he was just gifted as this orator, and he was this creative genius with an incredible memory. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, first off, I read the book. I thought it was an interesting take. Davis essentially is creating this hybrid Vogel explanation where he's willing to accept some of Vogel's premises on the fact that there were possibly plates. He says, I can be agnostic on that. But then he starts talking about it being basically a form of a sermon, and he starts explaining how sermons were done in the 19th century versus how they're done today. I preach the way he describes. Okay, so when he was writing, I mean, I'm an evangelist. I preach all over the world. And when I do, I don't have notes. I preach extemporaneously. That's my church's mode and method to preaching the gospel. Okay, nothing's pre planned. We don't know who's going to speak on a given Sunday. We're trusting in the Spirit. So it was ironic to hear him explain something that matches something that I do every week and then
Mm,
somehow consider that I would have the skill set to write the Book of Mormon, which I don't. I it's to me he made no attempt to evaluate contemporary churches that preach in similar fashion and evaluate whether that such a method could then be applied to create a book of such magnitude. And that was where I felt he really starkly fell because he had source material contemporaneous to him that he refused to even address and learn. And ultimately his method falls short. It makes and just to go from a historical method, he makes no attempt then to explain the eyewitnesses. He makes no attempt to explain the visions that they had. He
hmm
makes no, he ignores all those things. So he looks at the text and says, well, this text could have been done with some extemporaneous, speaking and with a couple of notes here and there to propel him. So as he hits the note, then he's explaining it and moving along throughout this narrative. Well, that is counterintuitive to multiple people that were in the room that bore testimony. That's counterintuitive to Joseph Smith's own explanation. That's counter. So it doesn't match the eyewitness testimony. It ignores the eyewitnesses of the fact that there was an artifact as well that needs explained. And so what he ultimately has done is he fallen guilty to the best explanation of the facts. His explanation is contrived, it's made up, and it's not supported by the eyewitnesses, and it's not supported by all the surrounding facts as well. So it maybe it lines up within a narrative of how something could be produced quickly, and I think that's what he was ultimately trying to address, but it falls short in about five or other very simple ways where he has to either ignore the data, which he did in the book, and or he has to, just broad brush things. But you have to be able to explain how Joseph was able to convince witnesses that there were real golden plates. You have to be able to explain how Joseph Smith was able to convince people that there was a stone box and a hole on a hill that multiple people in both in and outside the church attested to the fact that they had seen for themselves. There's some basic historical grounds that now William Davis is not attempting to use all these data and do those things, and that's why the method falls short. Now, we could talk about other explanations as well. I did read that book. I found it interesting, but ultimately I was like, well, when are you going to talk about the witnesses? When are you going to talk about
mm.
the hole in the ground? When are you going to talk about the tangible artifact that was brought forth? And when are you going to address the fact that other people preach like this today and they can't possibly produce a book of this magnitude on their own? And ultimately, that's where the theory falls short in real practice and on historical grounds in multiple places.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If I went with a naturalistic explanation, it would be I did a video on this. It would be a combination of Dan Vogel and sort of Grant Palmer's theories for this is the influences he was drawing upon, and then how he actually did it. I would have went with William Davis's theory. One of the things that I think I struggled with that maybe I felt like it didn't fully account for, and you probably agree with me as a believer in the historicity of the Book of Mormon, is I do see strong ancient connections, particularly the Old World convergences, Nahum and Bountiful. You're a Mesoamerica like me. I see also some connections there. Particularly, I think the geology was quite persuasive. We talked about complex chiasmus and ancient names in the Book of Mormon, as well as some just a lot of complexity to the narrative, to the geography, which I'm not going to say impossible, but I'm going to say like would have taken not only an incredible religious and creative genius, but the memory and then keeping it all in your mind and then doing a creative oral dictation that's really, really impressive. But even if you granted Joseph could have done that, you're also saying that it doesn't explain the witnesses as well. It doesn't explain the stone box. So that's the first fact. You know, the Book of Mormon came forth. We have it was in a short time frame, 60 days. It's 588 pages, around 270,000 words, no notes, no manuscript, no sources. And it's a very complex book, and that would support to believers its divine authenticity, that he did it by inspiration, the gift and power of God. So why don't we talk next about the next fact? Talk about the stone box, because you highlight that a lot in your book, and I've done lots of episodes on the witnesses of the gold plates, and I feel bad. I've kind of like not really spoken much about the significance of the empty box, and I liked how you compared it to the empty tomb. So lay that out, and how is that a fact and an evidence?
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to. This has definitely been something that was unique to my book, but has caught on, and I'm really thankful for because the correlation between the empty tomb and the empty stone box on a hill that's known in New York needs to be spoken of more and more and more. Okay, because it's very strong and very compelling. Joseph claimed that the plates were interred and he procured them from, he kind of dug around a box, pried it open, and inside were the golden plates and other artifacts. So there was a stone box that was essentially the casket, the repository for the golden plates. And when he brought the plates out and he left, one thing that wasn't thought of by a lot of people, but man, I wish I could go back and dig that thing out and stick it on a shelf somewhere and preserve it, was the stone box. But multiple people talk about it. So let's apply the principles for the empty tomb and see how that corresponds to the empty stone box, because we have about 12 source documents that talk about the hill in the ground, its location, and the stone box, either all three or one of those three within the source materials. So the argument people would make for the empty tomb, right? We talked about proximity, the fact that the movement starts in Jerusalem. If you want to see the empty tomb, go see for yourself. Enemies, the best explanation was they must have stolen the body, right? And unlikely testimonies, the women were the first witnesses. Let's apply that for a moment to the golden plates, to the empty stone box in the hill, and see how that fleshes out. Well, first off, the hill is just a few miles from Palmyra. Joseph claims to get the plates, and the actual, where did they choose to print the Book of Mormon in 1830? They choose to print it with the witness statements in Palmyra, just a few miles away to the hill. The Book of Mormon could have been printed in Rochester, could have been printed in New York City. No, they print it right where everything happened. If you wanted to know whether Joseph really got an artifact out of a hole in the ground and out of a stone box, walk to the hill and see for yourself. And several did. And that's the beauty of it, is there's actual evidence for what there was initially with when he first procures the golden plates. There is a hotbed of attack from the money diggers, okay, from people that he had dug with in the past, all right, that wanted, they believed, number one, he did find an artifact, and number two, there's all this evidence that they were trying to steal it from him, get a copy of the proceeds, try and sell it for money. Joseph had something, we deserve a cut of it. Why did they believe that so strongly when they had dug together for years and never found anything? Well, the only explanation is that they were close enough in proximity to go see for themselves the hole in the ground and the stone box and realize, whoa, Joseph found something. We used to dig with him. We have a contract. We deserve a cut of the proceeds. The actions of the enemies, the earliest enemies to the movement, is not, oh, Joseph didn't find anything. He's full of it. He's never found something. Why should we believe
Yeah, because
That's
today
not how
people's
people
reactions
react
of,
in the
oh,
area.
where are the plates today? Oh, the angel took them back. There never were plates. But when Joseph first got the plates, everyone around him believed he really did have a plate artifact.
Yeah. There's nowhere in the record where somebody at the time's going, oh, he's just absolutely full of it. In fact, you know, one of the most unlikely testimonies is Josiah stole. Okay. And this is more on the golden plates than the stone box. So forgive me for going out of order a little bit on
That's okay.
this.
We'll
But,
come back to the stone box.
you know, yeah, Josiah, his family believes he's been defrauded. He was paying Joseph for months and months to try and find a silver mine that didn't exist. And, the treasure hunt sometimes that people look at like a black stain. I look at it and go, this is great evidence. This is good stuff. He's taken before a court. Josiah's put on the stand, and Josiah says, well, I wasn't defrauded because claiming to have some supernatural gift and having a fake artifact, that was actually, you were considered defrauding somebody, you could go to jail. This was a persecutable offense from the day and time. Josiah's on the stand and says, well, I wasn't defrauded, and I know it. And they're like, well, how can you say that? I said, well, I was in the Smith home the night that Joseph brought the plates into the house. And he passed him through the window. And when he passed him through the window, the frock lifted, and caught a glimpse, and he described the golden plates.
Hmm.
It's an amazing, and that wasn't found till like 15 years ago. So those court records were found, and people were like, oh my goodness, here's another witness, an unlikely witness. In fact, he's the most unlikely witness. If
That would have been
anybody
the
should have been,
1830 when he was brought to court because he was brought 1826. That was the famous glass liquor
yeah,
hearing. That would have been, I think, March. But obviously, that he was there the night that Joseph got the plates, which would have been 22nd of September. So this was the 1830 court record where he's giving his
correct.
testimony.
Exactly right. I think it was June 1830, but don't quote me on that. But I think it
Okay.
was summer of 1830 when that happened, and he gave that explanation. He's the most unlikely testimony. You would not expect a treasure hunter, somebody that was funding this fraudulent effort, right, to step up and say, "Oh no, no, it's real," because he was in it for the money. Okay, he was funding it. He was funding the expeditions. Okay, but instead he stands up, and by the way, he eventually gets baptized. He's like a Paul on an unlikely conversion side of the fence because he saw, why was he converted to all this? He saw the plates for himself. He knew that they were real, and he believed, the report because he was an eyewitness. So now when it comes to the empty stone box, uh, Martin went back to the hill. David went back to the hill. And what piques David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery to first get real interested? Well, David was traveling through on a train, and all the scuttlebutt is going around, and people are talking. And a couple of people are on the train with him, and they're convinced that Joseph has something. He says, well, how do you know? And they say, well, we went to the hill. We saw for ourselves. And that sparked David so strongly. Here's one of our three witnesses. How does he first come to be convicted and believe in what was going on, to want to explore this? And Oliver and David talk about it, and Oliver goes to explore for himself. What spurs that? It spurs from a testimony of unbelievers, from enemies that saw the empty hole in the ground for themselves. Now, years later, everything goes by. There's a couple of believers. They come through the area. They want to see the hill for themselves. They want to interview locals. They find a local elderly gentleman. He says, "Oh yeah, it was on the this side of the hill. Up on the north end. You go up on I believe it was the west side on the north end. You go up the hill. You'll see. There used to be. It got plowed over many times since then. But he says the stone and the stone that was there, the hole in the ground, that it sat exposed for years. And he says eventually probably through plowing and stuff, it ended up getting broken up and carried down and, became nothing for years of plowing over. But here's a testimony from a non-believer local decades later saying, oh yeah, that used to be right there. And he names the exact spot. He tells this group of believers that were traveling through exactly where to go, exactly where the spot was, because it was exposed in public data. You even have another treasure hunter with Joseph, Lorenzo Saunders. he gives two things that when I saw it in the record, I was like, oh man, this is good. Somebody had to have caught this before. So you know, he was trying to, in multiple interviews, disparage the Smiths, say they didn't find anything. Initially he's part of the group that's persecuting. All right. So he wasn't real honest about the fact that early on he thought Joseph had something. But years later, he's being
At this
interviewed
point,
and
it's like,
says,
oh, this is absurd. I knew it
yeah,
was
this was
ridiculous from the
always
start.
fake from the beginning. People should have talked to me first, years later. But in the interview, he drops a couple hints that shortly afterwards, they went to the spot on the hill where the plates were supposedly procured. Ding, ding, ding. First off, he's admitting that he knew the spot. Okay, well, how would he have known that if there wasn't a hole in the ground? So he's making a concession he doesn't think he's making or doesn't intend to make, where he knew where the exact spot was. In another interview, he identifies it on the west side, so he knew exactly where it was, and he even verifies it. But he says that they did find a hole in the ground, but no loose dirt. And when I
Yes, I
saw
remember
that, I
reading
was
that in
like,
your book.
yeah, it's like no loose dirt. I was like, that's exactly right. Joseph goes to the hill in 1823. He procures the plates in 1827. The dirt would have been loosed from him digging in the spot in 1823. Otherwise, he just would have been brushing stuff on to conceal it and brushing stuff off to reveal it. So by 1827, there would have been no loose dirt to reveal. So even in Lorenzo Saunders' account that's meant to disparage the Smiths and meant to disparage Joseph, he reveals something that first he admits there's the hole in the ground. In another interview, he verifies the location on the west side. And then in that same account, he's identifying the fact that it would have been excavated years before, which is exactly what Joseph did. He excavated it multiple years before. In an attempt to vilify the Smiths, he drops some historical nuggets that actually offer tremendous support to the historical narrative as Joseph Smith told it himself. So while that might seem subtle, here's another account of an enemy giving an unlikely testimony which supports the narrative that there really was a hole in the ground on the northwest side of the hill and there really was an empty stone box. So over and over again, the evidence either for the hole in the ground or the empty stone box as an artifact itself, as a repository where the plates were procured, is an extremely strong lineup, and I would argue it's equally, if not more strong than the evidence for the empty tomb and the resurrected Christ. So that's the
Oh,
comparison I'm making. The resurrected Christ is kind of akin to the golden plates there on historical grounds, and then you know, the both are repository caskets that once held the actual artifact in question.
that's interesting. So you're saying that both believing witnesses like David Whitmer and Martin Harris talk about the empty stone box, but also unbelieving neighbors attest to it as well. So there's multiple sources, and we know that they experienced a lot of persecution after Joseph got the plates. Like he couldn't start translating until he went to Harmony because people were trying to break in to get the plates and bargain for them. Now you mentioned to me, and I've not looked into Dan Vogel's response or what he says on the stone box, but you mentioned to me off air that he doesn't find it very or very credible, and maybe he has a couple of sources that he thinks undermines the empty stone box. Could you just briefly address, what's his argument and what's your refutation to it?
In publication, he has referenced the location on the hill one time in published material, so I'll address his publication. He did so to dismiss the accounts that there was a stone box on the hill on the west side. When he did, he was using a third-hand source from the late 1800s that was also fanciful. It contained multiple errors throughout the source itself. And now I do think there were some later excavations on the east side done by, I think there's enough evidence within the source documents to show that later people were digging in the hill trying to find something else.
Like decades
Okay.
after?
Yeah, and or it may be even just a few years after people might have been on the east side trying to dig something and people were maybe digging all over the hill. I think that certainly happened. But the source he used to dismiss maybe 10 accounts that talk about the Northwest End, the stone box, he's using a third hand source from somebody that wasn't there that talks about some of the holes on the east side, which I'm not refuting that there might have been some holes dug up on the east side. But he is really not dealing with, and even though, listen, I like Dan Vogel, I respect him. I
Me
think
too,
it's a
yeah.
big concession. I think it's a big concession for an agnostic to look at the source material and say, yes, I believe there actually were a set of plates. There was an artifact. I think that's a big concession. I think it's time for him to concede that there also was a hole in the ground that had a stone box in it. I think there's strong enough data from direct sources, firsthand sources, and secondary sources to overwhelmingly suggest when you're evaluating the two based on the best explanation of the facts that there really was a hole in the ground right where Joseph said it was. So
And you said you
that
were on Ward Radio. You did a deep dive response to Dan Vogel, and I think if I'm remembering right, I think I might have read an article by was it maybe Anthony Sweat, a BYU Studies article, I think, that talked about the stone box as well. That went through the sources quite thoroughly, but a lot of it's in your book as well, and that
yeah.
needs to be taken into account as well. Um, Now, you did mention in your book, this is sort of like a side topic, so I don't want to spend much time on it, but you mentioned and acknowledged Joseph Smith's treasure digging, and that's sort of
Yeah.
an area of controversy, and it's something that critics bring up a lot is Joseph's involvement in treasure digging, being hired as a treasure seer. The most well documented is him, boarding with the Hales, working for Josiah Stoll, trying to find treasure or the silver mine, and then Joseph being brought to court because his Josiah Stoll's nephew thought that Joseph was conning his uncle. And some people would view that as, was he just being this con man? Was he tricking people in his youth? Was he pretending he could see buried treasure by putting the stone in the hat? And then people think like, oh, he's doing the same gig when it comes to the Book of Mormon. This was sort of a cultural practice. Maybe some of the more elite sort of looked down upon it, but in rural sort of frontier America, it seemed like people were engaged in this. But what's your view on it? Because from my reading of what you said in the book, and I think I kind of lean this way as well, you don't really defend Joseph Smith's treasure digging, that this might have been something of his follies in his youth, maybe even misusing his spiritual gifts and perhaps a barrier to him obtaining the plates. Because you talk about, I think it's in
I
Joseph's,
definitely lean that way. Yeah.
yeah,
I
in
definitely lean that way. Yeah.
in Joseph's 1832 history, he talks about one of the reasons he didn't get the plates was because he kind of wanted them to get rich, partly. You could see that he was sort of conflicted. He wants to, do God's mission. But then he's also like, hey, this is a lot of money. This could get my family out of poverty. So what's your view on Joseph Smith's treasure digging then?
Well, I think he did it. I, I'm always surprised by some apologetics that are out there that claim even still that it didn't happen. I think the historical records are clear that that was something he participated in, and the warnings are clear, right? He's warned the year before that if he doesn't get it right, that he's never going to obtain the plates. Now, what's the possible explanation for that? You know, except we look at what he was doing at the time he was doing it and something he didn't do after. And those things were the treasure seeking that he was doing. So I, I personally, this is just personal opinion, okay? But my personal opinion is I don't see Joseph as being prepared in any way by doing treasure seeking. That just doesn't line up to me with the facts as I read the narrative. But what I do see in that, when I'm looking at it from historical grounds and I consider the miracle that follows, is what I was talking about before. The amazing thing is I can use the actions of the treasure hunters and what they saw and what they felt were, their belief in the fact that Joseph really procured something as the most unlikely testimony of all that he actually did have something of value within his possession when it came forth. So I don't try and justify what he did prior to. I think we all make, I you want to do some digging on Josh Gehly? I've made mistakes. You're going to find out that I've made mistakes. I'm a sinner saved by Christ. So is Joseph Smith. He's a sinner saved by Christ. Used by God in a mighty way, thank God. But when I look at his past, it's like, okay, he made mistakes along the way. He was warned about them. He repents afterwards. He writes letters to the early church repenting for previous folly in his youth. So, those are things that he had to kind of fess for in front of the congregation. And that type of transparency and honest, I think, is a healthy thing for any leader of any church to do. So, I don't try and justify his treasure seeking past. I kind of think that if I had the amount of poverty that he had, keep in mind that for those with counter explanations to all this, he didn't have enough money to buy paper to do the translation. Other people bought the paper for him. He had debts going into this endeavor that Martin Harris helped clear for him so that Martin didn't believe that somebody should be in debt while doing this type of important work for the kingdom of God. Okay, so they had gone through multiple moves, up to like 10 moves by the time this is all transpiring. They were church mouse poor doesn't even quite come to it, in my opinion. So, you know, I'm not going to blame a man for trying to find some silver in a hill. I'm not going to, I'm not going to blame Joseph for doing some treasure hunting. It was the get rich program of the day. Okay. And he was trying to get some money for his family and himself that might provide some security that they had never had before. So I guess maybe that's an explanation. I don't fault him for that. I don't fault somebody that falls guilty to a Ponzi scheme either in our day and time. People, really smart people, put money into Ponzi schemes too, and they don't work out. So I don't, forever abandon them and think that they're not somebody that I should listen to or hear what they have to say ever since that point. So to me, the treasure hunting is something that just the treasure digging, he did it. He did it. He participated in it for better or for worse. He was a leader and a part of it. And then God did something amazing. He changed and he was used by God for something miraculous afterwards. And there's a distinct change in the before and after, and I'm grateful for that. And I think that the testimonies that come before it can actually be used to enhance the moment of change, the moment when God did something pretty special.
In some ways, I almost resonate a little bit with Joseph having to almost like purge himself of his treasure digging and his greed before he was worthy and able to receive the gold plates. Equivalent, prior to me going and serving a mission for the church, as a lot of young men, I had some struggles with pornography, and I had to, try to overcome that. And
Me too.
maybe
Me
this was
too.
sort of like an equivalent in Joseph's day. This was his treasure digging, and I think there's an account I remember from Martin Harris who claims that Joseph was told by the angel that he needed to abandon the company with the money diggers. He wasn't to lie, cheat, or steal. And if I remember right, there was a source from Alva Hale, who's brother of Emma, who certainly was somewhat antagonistic towards Joseph, but he talked about that Joseph told him that all this peeping in stones to find buried treasure was sort of nonsense, almost like Joseph was sort of admitting that he'd either been deceived himself or if he'd been deceiving others, but he believed that the seeing in stones was a gift from God, as a seer, and whether or not you view it as Joe Smith was perhaps misusing spiritual gifts that he had, or he was repenting from this former practice, like I can, I can appreciate that there are maybe some things that he needed to repent of before he was able to get the plates as well. And that's yeah, it's something that can be challenging to people, especially if people view it as was he deliberately, fraudulently claiming to see treasure and then conning people as well. Yeah, it can be a complicated subject, but that's kind of how I read the history as well. That it seems like
Yeah.
this is something that Joseph, I don't know if we can necessarily justify or think everything was okay about what he was doing in his treasure digging activities.
And nobody hated it more than Emma's dad, his
Yeah, yeah.
soon to be father-in-law. He hated it, right? So, and then Joseph essentially elopes with Emma. So when they're coming back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to do some of the translation, like his father-in-law wants nothing to do with him. And he repents, he's bawling, and the account is a tearful account. And basically Emma's dad says, "Well, the plates can't be in the house with me. I don't want they're not allowed in my house. You guys can be over here." And but in that moment, he's allowed half the box. And he gives a description of the weight and the artifact of what was inside the bucket, and wasn't able to see it for himself. Just says, "Well, look, I actually have thing this time. You can hold it for yourself here." And he describes the appropriate weight, all these things from somebody that was an unlikely testimony, but he gives a testimony of the day that he held the box that contained the plates. He describes the weight. He just, he's able to kind of toss it about a little bit, and that is an unlikely testimony for the artifact that Joseph, in fact, had. You get
Right.
moments like that over and over. So when we talk about scope of the data, the breadth of the data, there's another data point that we have to account for when we're explaining what actually happened.
And that sort of leads to the next fact. I mean, we could lump these two together. I think this is a fact, that there was a plate artifact that Joseph had. So maybe we could talk about what are things that support that being a fact, and multiple people claim to either see or hold or feel the plate. So let's dive into that. The evidence that there was a plate artifact. We have numerous witnesses who either have a visionary experience of seeing the plates and the angel, or holding the plates, seeing the plates, holding them, or feeling of them covered in a cloth. So why don't we go over some of that?
19 some odd witnesses holding, hefting, handling, moving, seeing, touching, feeling, interacting with this incredible artifact. You have women, Catherine Salisbury claimed to be the one that Joseph passed it through his sister in the window. She grabs it, she holds the artifact. Emma claimed to move the plates from room
They
to
feel
room,
of the plates as well, finger them, apply
describing
them like thick paper.
sound,
Yeah,
describing shape, describing, we get sound, shape, color, weight. So what's amazing is there's and it's literally hundreds and hundreds of accounts. Okay, hundreds of accounts. If including unbelievers like Emma's dad, he gives an account of what he handled for himself. He didn't see it for himself, but he handled it for himself. So, when you compile everything together, it's almost impossible to say that Joseph didn't have anything. And that's where Dan Vogel and others have crossed the line to say, you know what? Yeah, he had something. And then they make up something contrived, right? Completely ad hoc. It's completely ad hoc to say that the man that didn't have money for paper somehow had money to buy tin and cut up tin in the cooper's shop across the road to make a fake set of manufactured plates. That's completely contrived. There's no evidence for it. It's completely ad hoc. But that's again, we end up in contrived and ad hoc explanations if you're not willing to admit that God exists and Jesus rose from the dead. But for the golden plates, the evidence is overwhelming. There's astounding on historical grounds. If this was anything besides a miracle in question, anything besides the golden plates in question, if this was any other event from history and we had this much data, it would be in every history book on the topic in a formative and assertive way. But because it's a miracle claim and because it's tied to a religious movement, it's untouchable. But on the same historical grounds that we would say the resurrection happened, we have the accounts from Martin Harris. Do you see, the sun shining out, just so real as you see this artifact, to people that are there? Do you see my hand? Oh, yeah, of course I see your hand. Well, just so real as you see this hand, so real were the golden plates. And they're happening in the same ways. We talked about on the last episode seeing something for yourself and being willing to be persecuted for a belief. So not only do we have the accounts, we have the eyewitnesses willing to be persecuted. Joseph gets tarred and feathered. He has an adopted son that dies in Caroline. Okay, Now, some might say, well, that wasn't directly caused by the plates. Well, let me tell you, if Joseph would have renounced the plates and walked away from the church, okay, he wouldn't have been tarred and feathered. All right, he wouldn't have had something to be attacked for. So these all link directly and indirectly to this event based on the persecutions that happen. David Whitmer is dragged out with about 20 other people in the center of Missouri and independence. He's dragged out in far west. Bayonets are pointed at him, and bayonets are pointed at all the other men that they dragged out. The women and children are watching, and they say, "Denounce the Book of Mormon, denounce your testimony, or you're going to make widows of all these people that we have the guns pointed to." Well, this is a moment, right? A moment of persecution. How would you react? How would I react? David Whitmer began to preach about the truth of what he had seen with his own eyes for himself. And his spirit was so strong that day that those that were holding the bayonets left that day ashamed from what they were intending to do. So, willing to die for what they had seen for themselves, willing to allow, imagine that, willing to allow a dozen or more other people to be killed based on your eyewitness testimony of what you had seen for yourselves. So there's persecution that happens from outside the church in, and then I take it a step further, and I have a full chapter on the in-church persecution that happens when we were all one organization in the 1830s. And it's not pretty then, all right? This was when you and I were arm in arm, brother. We were no different. This was our church, okay? No matter how you look at what happened after the death of Joseph Smith. We didn't even talk about Liberty Jail. Joseph and Hiram in prison in Liberty Jail. Hiram writes a letter saying he was being persecuted for the cause of Christ. Joseph Sr., back in the day, he had somebody threaten him to, throw these Book of Mormon editions in that first, throw them into the fire or you're going to jail. Because he had some tiny debt of like $5. It wasn't much of a debt. Or we're calling it, throw the books in the fire and we'll let it go, forget about the debt, or you're coming to prison. Joseph Sr. is willing to go to prison. He writes to his son he speaks to his son about how he was in prison for the cause of Christ, just like the Apostle Paul was. That's how dear his testimony to the Book of Mormon was, from an eyewitness. He was one of the 8 witnesses, all these people that I'm talking to. Hiram Page being willing to be beat up.
Yeah.
All kinds of things. But then the persecution comes from within the body. All right? Martin Harris is excommunicated by 1837. By 1838, David and Oliver, all 3 of the 3 witnesses are excommunicated by 1838 from the church that they founded. They are founding fathers to a church organization within 9 years, less than a decade, they're gone. They're gone. They're out of the church. If you're part of a conspiracy, if you have made something up, if you didn't really see something, if you were deceived, that is the time to shout to the moon about how wrong Joseph is, how wrong the church is, and how nothing, I was deceived, this is all false, or we were all in it together. Instead, every single witness that didn't have a last name of Smith either walks away from the church or is excommunicated. Every single one. And none of them renege on their testimony. Every single one that lived long enough gave more testimonies after those moments than before and stay strong. Martin is with William Parrish and a couple other people that were members of the church. He stays back in Kirtland. 1837 happens. He's excommunicated. Migration west happens. He's still, he never goes to far west. And there's a group that had been converted per se, and they were still left. They disagreed. They were not going west, and they're meeting together. And they're saying, what do we actually believe anymore within this restoration idea? And they decide, well, we're going to throw this away. We're not believing in this. And we definitely don't believe in that Book of Mormon. And Martin Harris jumps right up. He jumps right up and interrupts them. And he says, any one of you that reject the Book of Mormon will be damned. He says, I saw the plates for myself. the gift and power of God. That is from the Lord. You might reject some of these other things, but you can't reject the Book of Mormon. That's what he does mere months after his excommunication. It's a powerful testimony to what is being considered. When you weigh them out, the controversial statements, there might be 4 or 5 controversial statements compared to hundreds and hundreds of other statements. The historical record is overwhelming that all 11 witnesses, plus Joseph being 12, plus some of the miscellaneous others that add up to 19 or more, they're all supportive of the fact that there really were golden plates. The artifact, on historical grounds, is astounding. And I would argue there's no other explanation of the fact that doesn't make something up, that isn't contrived. You're either making up a set of tin plates, but then how do you explain the fact that we have multiple independent accounts of the color? Of the, so there's just, are you willing to consider the weight explanations but not the color explanations? It's like, well, now you're picking and choosing. So when we talk about explanatory power and scope, now you're accepting certain parts of testimonies but rejecting other parts of testimonies, versus having a golden set of plates best explains all the accounts that testify to the artifact itself. So instead of picking and choosing and cherry picking, the best explanation of the facts is there really were a set of gold plates around the 50 or 60 pound range, around the, again, like, about that size,
I'll
and
stand there.
yeah, about that size and
Where's the
shape,
green? I don't
and
see the green.
yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, there for
I
you.
must have taken the band off, so or whatever. But that's some of the data that's in the book in more detail with more direct quotes, obviously from
Yeah, and,
the
and some of the
witnesses
quotes
themselves.
are quite powerful. I guess the only 2 cents that I'll add to it, like I've done some videos on the witnesses, and I did one where I responded to Mormon stories and their sort of analysis and critiques, and they're bringing up a lot of the quotes you see in like Mormon Think or the CS Letter. They're typically second or third hand statements trying to portray that they, particularly Martin Harris, he saw with spiritual eyes, or the eye of faith, or he saw the places to see a city through a mountain. And one, like, spiritual eyes or eye of faith are scriptural terms, so it doesn't necessarily mean wasn't real. But then you've always got to be cautious if you're privileging a second or third hand account. But when you look at the majority of his first and second hand statements, they're very adamant. Like, he's very, very adamant, reaffirming the official testimony. Like, there's one here, from your book. Martin says to William Wadoops, I had the privilege of being with the prophet Joseph Smith, and with these eyes of mine, pointing to his eyes, I saw the angel of the Lord, and I saw the plates, and with these ears, pointing to his ears, I heard the voice of the angel, and with these hands, holding out his hands, I handled the plates concerning the record of the Book of Mormon, and I assisted the prophet in the translation thereof. And there's so many statements from them where they give just very adamant, profound testimonies. I'll maybe just read one more that I like from. Okay, I don't know where it is, but it's basically like his deathbed testimony where he's like, saying that it was no dream, no vain imagination of the mind. It was real, and so many of their first and second hand statements, they affirm like the reality of, that they saw the angel, they saw the plates, they heard the voice of God, this audio visual experience, that all three of them happen to have and reaffirm. And similar with the eight witnesses, the majority of their statements support them seeing and handling the plates tangibly, supporting their official testimony. And then when you combine these unofficial or informal witnesses, Mary Whitmer, who was shown the plates by the angel, um, disconnected from Joseph. Obviously, Joseph was there, but if anything, she was annoyed with Joseph and Oliver for not helping with the chores. So probably not in a state to have a hallucination, but then she was shown the plates by the angel, and other people who fell to the plates, covered in a cloth, I think really supports there was a plate artifact. Now, I just want to bring up briefly your quick responses to some of the counter explanations to the witnesses. So the first one is the three witnesses. Okay, they were religiously sincere, and they really thought they saw the angel in the plates, but it was a joint hallucination. And that's why they were part of a conspiracy. That's why they kept reaffirming their testimonies. They were sincere. They thought they knew it was true, but a mass hallucination. What's your thoughts on the three of them having a mass hallucination?
Well, it goes back. There's really two counterpoints I would make. The first is the fact that the experiences are different. Martin and Joseph's experience is different and unique compared to Oliver, David, and Joseph's experience
Right,
together.
he had to
So,
separate.
yeah, so it's independently attested. They're not exactly the same. One, all the artifacts are laid out basically in a visionary table. The plates are on the table. The angel's there. They hear a voice. The second, Martin almost doesn't let it unfold. He sees the angel, he sees the plates, and he shouts out, tis enough, mine eyes have beheld, mine eyes have beheld." However long that was until that moment. So it's not like they saw the exact same thing, although they did both see the plates and the angel, but it's being independently attested.
Hmm.
So that's remarkable. So with that independent attestation, it's hard to get a hallucination like that. And first off, multiply attested by, different ones. So again, from hallucination, it's hard to make that the explanation because people, again, with either mental health trouble or whatever, they're if it's a mass hallucination, they're not seeing the same thing.
Mm. And
So
I know
that's
Vogel has
a
said like, oh,
pushback
well,
on
we
it.
can't be certain they saw the exact same angel, and critics would say they were crying for this, they were expecting it. Whenever I looked up people that are susceptible to hallucinations, statistically it's around 10 to 15% of people. I'm assuming that it would have been around that maybe in their day, maybe it might have been more. But the odds that Joseph picked three witnesses that would all have a mass hallucination. Like it's not just you have to multiply the odds. So if you go with 10% of people are susceptible to mass hallucination, the fact that all three of them would have a mass hallucination is like a 1 in 1,000 chance, even if you, and that's even granting that it was the same hallucination. And Joseph also, if he's the author of the Book of Mormon, wrote in the Book of Mormon about three witnesses seeing the plates, which is a very bold and risky thing to prophesy, and then it being kind of a 1 in 1,000 thing to actually pull off. Like, if you're a fraud, that's a risky thing. Like, to guarantee they'd have this mass hallucination experience, which they never deny, and they reaffirm they're absolutely adamant. They know they saw the angel in the plates and heard the voice of God. That's quite the thing to pull off. But then you've got the eight witnesses who, even if they're like, "Oh, that's too visionary. That could have been a hallucination." You've then got the issue of the eight witnesses who saw and handled the plates. What's your thoughts on the people who say, "Well, the eight witnesses also saw it in a visionary state, covered in a cloth. They didn't actually see and handle the plates." What do you say to that?
Well, you can say anything you want, I guess. You're allowed to, I mean, when you're giving an explanation on historical grounds, you're allowed to make anything up you want. But the question then is, does it ultimately jive with the source material? And that does not jive with the 60 some odd accounts that we have from the eight witnesses that are describing a very practical, tangible interaction with the plates. So much so, Martin didn't even feel like the witness was on the same level as his, okay, in some of his explanation with the eight witnesses. So, the eight witnesses, all the historical data says they're seeing, holding, handling, and eventually they describe the plates in a very consistent way. The other part of this where hallucination doesn't make sense is how do they all describe the same artifact in the same way, with the same rough weights, with the same rough dimensions, with the same binding, with the same two-thirds bound, with the how do you consistently, multiply, independently attest that there's a black patina stain on the engravings? Like, that seems like remarkable detail for joint hallucinations to somehow cross-thread over 3 to 4 independent events and across, up to 12 people. That just seems a little bit. It, Somebody might say the golden plates are far-fetched. I would say a counter explanation to it all just being a mass hallucination and the eight witnesses as well when there's such consistency in the description of the artifact, seems highly far-fetched. It just seems like, somebody would need to first read, Jerry Grover's book on Ziff and the Magic Goggles, and where he compiles those events. And I have like a paragraph or two on that in the book about the shape, the color, the weight, the sound, and all the fact that the plates are reasonable size enough in the right language to even have the text exist, and all of that coming from a mass hallucination through Joseph, being the coordinator of that. That's just not something. Again, I would ask everybody to take the miracle hat off for a moment, because that's the conclusion you can only make at the end. Here at this beginning part, we're just evaluating the facts and the sources and the data. The consistency of the descriptions of the artifact render it impossible to conclude that it's a hallucination, based on the actual source material that you have and the detail within that description. How does a hallucination measure weight? And yet, Dan Vogel's willing to admit weight because his counter explanation takes weight into account when he talks about the tin plates. But a hallucination would not give a weight description. So then that falls into conspiracy. But conspiracy would break down based on the fact that all the witnesses not named Smith are excommunicated from the church. So do we have a hallucination and conspiracy mixed together? I mean, how contrived and ad hoc and implausible do we get down the rabbit hole of explanation of counter theories are we willing to go? It just seems illogical when all you have to do is posit the fact that God exists and Jesus rose from the dead. And once you do those two things, everything fits into place perfectly.
And one thought I have on the eight witnesses, because as I've done research into it, and I did an episode with Stephen Smoot and Neil Rapley on the Stephen Burnett ladder, quite in depth, so I don't want to get too much into that. But the majority of their first and second hand statements again reaffirm their official testimony. They just repeat over and over seeing and handling the plates in a tangible way with these eyes, with these hands. They make it quite clear. And I think the prominent naturalistic theory, although I think Dan Vogel concludes they're covering the cloth, but if you didn't want to believe that they're ancient plates delivered by an angel, you would have to conclude that Joseph committed metallurgical fraud, created his own set of plates that had the appearance of gold, with engravings on it, that tricked the eight witnesses so they passed visual inspection for the eight witnesses. And then the three witnesses had a mass hallucination experience, which they never deny, audio-visual, which Joseph was bold enough to prophesy and then pull off. I guess, like, I know it's hard to believe an angel in gold plates, that narrative, but that's also quite hard to believe. Like, what's your thoughts on that counter explanation that, well, hey, Joseph could have made his own set of plates that tricked the eight witnesses. They're not metallurgists, so how could they tell it was ancient, and three witnesses hallucination? That's it explained.
I'm fine with that explanation as long as you're willing to admit that you're making that. You're making it up ad hoc. It's contrived. It's just made up. It's not based on any of the source material or evidence. If that's your explanation, just say, this is my explanation because I don't believe in God, and I'm making this up because I have no better explanation because God doesn't exist. That should be how you should answer that. If you're not willing to say it that way, then you're not being very honest, because you're ultimately dismissing, like John Whitmer's interview, where he goes back and forth. Did you see it with yourselves? Yes. Were they covered with a cloth? John Whitmer responds, no. So you're directly contradicting the eyewitness statements that they made for themselves. And so I guess you're allowed to throw out the historical record. I guess you're allowed to throw out the sources to make a counter explanation. But just be honest with the fact, well, I'm just doing it because I don't have a better explanation, because they had to be covered because, and then you have to explain the consistency. How is the color always the same? How are the size and the weights always the same? How is the binding described the same? If it was just a covered artifact, how would you be able to describe it? Why do two different accounts describe the engravings with the black patina? I mean, that seems like a random detail to be offered multiply independently attested over multiple states, distances, and not coordinated together for something that was covered with a cloth that they never actually could have seen that for themselves.
Mm.
You're
I
you're
guess a
just
critic could say like, oh, well, maybe the weight and the dimensions, the height, the length, and the rings, they could maybe have determined that from feeling it. But I get what you mean in terms of like actually with the eight witnesses describing the color of the leaves and things. Like I read their testimonies as like, oh no, this actually they are affirming the official testimony.
yeah.
It's not at odds with it.
And John Whitmer specifically says he sees it uncovered. So you have to ignore him and say, well, he lied. You
Or it's not
know,
a credible interview.
yeah, yeah, exactly. To counteract that, and it just doesn't jive with the full breadth of the data for me.
What if someone were to bring up Strang's witnesses? William James Strang was also, succeeded or was part of the succession crisis and had his own break-off group, and he had plates, the Vori plates, and he had some witnesses, and so it could say like, "Hey, look, he had witnesses. We don't know if they ever denied." So Joseph Smith's witnesses of the plates aren't very special or compelling. What would be your response to Strang's witnesses, and what do you think are maybe some differences between his witnesses and Joseph's?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is archaeology from Penn State. So fraudulent
Oh, okay.
artifacts from the 19th century is no shock. All right. There were fraudulent artifacts, the Michigan relics. There's all kinds of examples of fraudulent artifacts from that time period being created. And I am not an expert on the Voorhees plates, although I understand what they were and who James Strang was. But my understanding is some of the eyewitnesses that even saw it, I am certain that he fabricated a set of plates. It
Yeah, I
seems
think
like
at
the
least one
historical
witness said that.
record,
Yeah.
yeah, the record seems overwhelming that he had made a set of plates. And I think one of the witnesses even says he saw them making him, saw him making them. So it seems so the difference the fact that the claims are not with the witnesses that they came from a hole in the ground or a specific location, and here's the spot in the ground where I procured them, and here's the revelation of how it came with it, and here's the angel that visited, and we all saw the angel. So this is where both the three witnesses and the eight witnesses are important, not just for the artifact itself, but for how it was procured and who it came from. There's greater, essentially, you're either accepting James Strang's explanation on how it came about and nobody else's, because he's the only one to describe how it came to be, versus with the three and the eight witnesses and the accounts of the hole in the ground and the accounts of the stone box. You have testimonies from enemies, unbelievers, and witnesses for themselves and non-believers in the artifact, and the method and mode of its procurement and process of translation, really far beyond. And Dan Peterson did a nice article in the Interpreter Foundation comparing the two and showing some of the differences, and that might be a good reference point for people as well.
Right. Yeah. I think as well, like I, having gone through my own faith crisis and having my own issues with the church history, even like there's even some arguments and criticisms that can be leveled against Book of Mormon, anachronisms and archaeology, things such as that. Although I think you also need to deal with some of the best evidence in favor. But even whenever I was out of the church and not believing, I can still remember watching Dan Vogel and Mormon stories, and he was talking about Joseph Smith's treasure digging and naturalistic theories for the Book of Mormon, and I was loving it. And then when he came to his theory for the plates, even though at that point I didn't find the three witnesses very credible because I'd only really looked at the second or third hand statements presented in critical documents, not the majority of the first or second hand ones. So already I didn't find this witnesses super credible. But whenever I first heard his theory about Joseph making his own set of plates to trick the witnesses, and then they had a hallucination, I remember thinking at the time, like, man, like that's also like really improbable. Like I understand believing the angel gold plates is hard to believe. I was like, that's also hard to believe. And I have a family member who no longer believes. And whenever I told this family member about Dan Vogel's theory about Joseph making his own set of plates, she just thought it was absurd. She was like, but where would he have gotten like the money to get the tin, and how would he have made the plates? Would he have had the metallurgical skills? Surely there would have been some people that would have said like, oh, we saw Joseph go into the hill with scraps of tin and he made it. Like she just didn't find it plausible at all.
He was in that Cooper shop all the time, except
Yeah,
nobody
yeah.
says that. Yeah.
And I was like, well, I tend to agree with you. And I said, and she said, I just don't think there are any plates. And I was like, well, the problem with that is just all the documents that there are. Three, the eight, the informal witnesses, people trying to take the plates. It's basically a historical fact. He had some sort of plate artifact, whether or not you want to believe it's modern or ancient. And then she posited, well, uh, because of that, maybe he just found plates in a hill because he was a treasure digger. And I was like, okay, well, that's also like highly, highly implausible as well. But then it also doesn't explain, the three witnesses as well. And going back to the witnesses of Strang, he didn't have any supernatural witnesses who had a vision. I think his witnesses, I think, did actually, yeah, like we saw plays that were shown to us. But he doesn't have the combination of the three and the eight, which are quite strong collectively. And I think like when you think about Joseph Smith, the things that if the Book of Mormon was a fraud, not only would it he needed to have this incredible creative and religious genius, knowing the Bible extremely well, and all these theological and Protestant things from his time, but also this creative genius, the memory would have needed, and then to orally dictate all of that in the space of around 65 days without notes or manuscript, but then also to have the skills to create metal plates, to pass visual inspection for the eight witnesses, to prophesy, and then for there to be a mass solution of the three witnesses. Like all that is also like really hard to believe. And if he pulled that off, like that's quite remarkable. like that's a really impressive fraud.
If he pulled it off, it's a fraud of all time. It's a fraud of all time because he also produced a text that's not even accounting for the contents of the text he produced, which has generated tens of millions of believers. So that that in and of it, so that still resonates and connects with people today that engage with the same revelations of God revealing it to themselves today. So the experiential side of it even carries forth to 2025. So that's remarkable that 200 years after all this was starting to go down, that people would still believe in the product he produced as genuine. And so the it would be as big of a heist as the disciples successfully stealing the body and creating a false narrative and somehow believing it or deceiving others into believing it and creating a modern religion of Christendom that carries through for today. It would be as equal of a remarkable heist and fraud as a fake resurrection from the dead as a fake set of golden plates and product produced that somehow it's of equal height and breadth as the resurrection, either in the miraculous or in the fraud. And I just happen to believe that the miraculous is more, far more logically sound than any
Yeah.
other counter explanation on both counts.
Okay, I got two final questions. Then I'll let you go. This is I've been taking a lot of your time, but this has been fun. So someone might say, look, witness testimony isn't evidence. Even if they claim to see plates, claim to have visions, this isn't compelling evidence. And even if we don't have a compelling naturalistic explanation, these extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and these witnesses don't pass the bar to prove or demonstrate that the Book of Mormon is a divine ancient text or that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and resurrected. This isn't this isn't evidence. What would you say to that?
I'd say amen. This is a step of faith for anybody. Absolutely. Yes, I can make a historical argument and I'm happy to do it. And I do. I think my argument is sound and logical. If you want to disagree with it in the end, that's fine. This is a belief system for me. This is something that has to be revealed to your heart. Also, the experiential side of this should not be dismissed. So that may not be the answer you were necessarily looking for when you asked the question, but ultimately, if the logical and historical case doesn't compel you, that's fine. I'm at the end of the day, this logical and historical case is only a backdrop for me. It's not the foreground. The foreground for me is my faith in Christ and how He's revealed Himself to me, and the experiential side of how I've seen lives changed and powerful witnesses of the Book of Mormon's truth. And the experiential is kind of the final piece for me in the book that I make, and it's one of the last chapters where, for Mary Whitmer, which you referenced earlier, when she was frustrated at Joseph and Oliver because they were a burden and not a blessing, and they were only eating her out of house and home and not helping on the farm, and when they finally weren't working 8 to 10 hours a day on the text, they were out in the back throwing rocks and just you know skipping stones and giving themselves a little bit of a break versus helping out on the farm. And she was frustrated. A man of God walked by her and showed her the plates. An angel of the Lord walked by her and showed her the plates, and she was satisfied. And she went from frustrated to faithful. And you know, I don't blame somebody for having a critical outlook on on something that has spiritual ramifications. Bring it on. You know, doubts are welcome in my house. Critique concerns welcome in my house. But my house is a house of faith. Any miracle from history is a step of faith. But be that as I make assumptions in the book, I just am upfront enough to tell you what they are. All I'm asking for the atheist and the agnostic is to say, my assumption is God does not exist, and I'm not willing to bend on that at all. If you want to start with that, I'm okay with you having any other naturalistic explanation, but you have to lay your assumptions out first. My assumption is that Christ is alive and He's risen and sits at the right hand of the Father. That's my assumption. Everything else on historical grounds falls perfectly into place. If you're not willing to carry those assumptions into your own pursuit of what happened, then you might come up with a different conclusion. That's okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. You talk about that in the last chapter that this is plausible evidence, or it's an intellectual case, which can enhance belief or cause someone who's maybe agnostic to really consider this and open up, but faith is still required. That's part of my paradigm. Is I believe that God will provide evidence. I believe part of the reason that witnesses were given is to be evidence, both of the resurrection and of the divinity of the Book of Mormon and the authenticity of the plates. But it doesn't prove it to the world.
No. And you have to be able to take your argument to its logical conclusion, which I will always push somebody on. All right. If they're willing to engage this far into depth with me, you know, oh, I'm not going to accept eyewitness testimony. Okay. Well, then, the logical conclusion is to throw out our entire judiciary system. Okay. Throw out the entire common law era of history, because everything we do in judging somebody in the court of law is based on evidence, and we accept primary eyewitness testimony as part of that whole process under the common law system of our day and time. So the logical conclusion of I'm not willing to consider eyewitness testimony of something powerful and grand, boy, I sure hope that's not true when you're on judge and jury, in the common law era, because we accept eyewitness testimony as foundational to our entire judicial system.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, final question, like in a nutshell, what would you say? Like, what's sort of your thesis or your summary in a nutshell of this book? We've talked a lot about the evidence and case for the
Yeah.
resurrection and the Book of Mormon. Just give us your final thoughts on everything we've covered and what you want the outcome to be of this.
My final conclusion is don't believe anything I've said for the last 2 hours. Go into prayer, ask the Lord, let Him reveal truth to you. He is the source of truth. He is real. Christ is alive. We serve a living God. Jesus Christ is alive and sits at the right hand of the Father, and He can answer. My final point is, sure, read the book. That's great, if you want to. But that's not my plea. My plea is get on your knees and ask the Lord and let Him direct you, because when He answers, that is real and that is true, and He's the source of all truth. So go to Him.
Love that. Well, Josh Gehly, thank you so much for coming on. I've absolutely loved this interview and this discussion with you. And maybe I'll bring you back again because you are also big into Book of Mormon evidences in Mesoamerica. So maybe we can come back and do an episode on that. But I appreciate your book, your work, your time, and invite everyone as well. Go check out the book, Witnessing Miracles, Historical Evidence for the Resurrection, and the Book of Mormon. And if you've enjoyed this, please like and share and subscribe. If you care to donate, you can via PayPal or Patreon as well. And we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.